We're here to talk about the ways that grant makers and grant seekers can work better together. We hope to give you some practical advice and to hear from you as well. So please chime in with questions. I know you've had a long day already of things, so we would love to hear from you as much as possible. And as we talk, I'm sure there are things we'll discuss that we've written articles about, or there's data you can find that's useful. So I'll tweet out a few things later just to be helpful. Always feel free, if there's anything that you need in the philanthropy world that you're having trouble finding about information, we're really happy to help. We depend a lot on hearing from our readers. That's how we do better. So we love your suggestions about ideas for stories and things that we can do. And I really see part of our role as being able to bring nonprofits together with foundations and donors. We really see ourselves as neutral players, and it's very important to us that we talk a lot about how every side of the equation can do better, because after all, we all know that the problems of the world are just getting greater and greater, and we need to find ways to tackle them, and that's what we're really all about. So I have two terrific people here to talk about this topic, and I would love them to tell you a little bit about their background so that you'll have a sense of why they're on this panel. And I'm gonna start with Kathy.
Great, thank you, Stacy. I just want to clarify when the title slide comes back on, that Tyler and I do not work for the same organization.
Yes.
And yes,
or,
that's true.
I don't know.
That's true. Someday.
We'll see how this goes.
But when Tyler introduces himself, he'll clarify that. So I'm Kathy Cochin. I'm the president and CEO of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are a over 30-year health advocacy organization. For those years, for those decades, we have continued to be the clear, strong consumer voice in the nation's capital to improve the health of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And we bridge our communities from the Atlantic to all across the Pacific to the highest levels of government, the administration, to Congress, and the Supreme Court, in order to make sure that policies are responsive to the needs of all communities of color, and in particular, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. My own journey, I've been at the Health Forum for almost 9 years now. In my 40-year career, I've been only in the nonprofit sector. I just don't know what else to do besides nonprofit work. And of those, 10 of those years have actually been in grant making, right here at the Tides Foundation. And then most recently, for just a little over a year, I've have the honor of being a trustee at the Kresge Foundation. So my day job, and for the majority of my career, I've been a grant seeker, but certainly have been on the other side of that experience as well.
Tyler?
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Wow, it is the end of the day, but I need a little bit more energy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I was raised in the South, so when someone gives you a call, you provide a response. It is good to be with everyone today. I work at Amalgamated Bank, which was not on the screen, but perhaps one day it will be, which is America's largest socially responsible bank, or at least that's what the marketing department told me to say this afternoon. We are a bank that was nearly 100 years old, started by union workers in New York City. And I have the pleasure of leading the bank's philanthropy banking strategy and a number of our PRIs and mission-driven investments as well. But I come to you all with a little bit of a journey that did not start at a bank, that actually started fighting the banks as a community organizer during the foreclosure crisis, where I kind of gained firsthand knowledge about extractive systems of finance and racial injustice related to who was getting those loans and who was most affected by that crisis. After doing community organizing for a number of years, I stepped into the policy space, where I had the opportunity to kind of bring that energy to public policy throughout the state of Michigan and other places as well. And when it was when I was there that I received a call from a Spend Down Family Foundation in Michigan and was asked to join their team. And so I joined the Dyer Ives Foundation as it started that Spend Down. So yes, I took a job at an organization that was closing. But it was a really important opportunity to kind of cut my teeth in the world of philanthropy. And after being there for several years, had the pleasure of leading the grant-making investments at the Solutions Project, which was started by Leonardo DiCaprio, Mark Ruffalo, and others to make clean energy grants and investments. And I think, it's important, to kind of pull off of Kathy's history a little bit. It's important that, folks come from both sides of this aisle. And I think that, Stacy, to your question around how do we come together, I think this is a moment that philanthropy is really asking those questions, and having that varied experience is so important. So I'm excited to be here and be with you all this afternoon.
Terrific. Just to level set us, I'm curious what you think. You've both been in the field for a while. Are things better in terms of grant maker, grant seeker relationships? About the same? Getting worse? What would you say if you had to evaluate over the time you've been in the field of philanthropy?
I think that the concept of venture philanthropy has been a really interesting development. I mean, certainly kind of you've been in that field. I think the hard part, and I learned this hard lesson when I was in grant making myself, is yeah, you think you can do better than how philanthropy's been done for like 200 years or something like that, but there's a lot of lessons there too, So, but I do think what is good is I think that there is a broader kind of democratization, if you will, in thinking about how grant making is done, and certainly the systems development that Flux and other folks here are concentrating on is really, really helpful. But I think the big shift that's really needed is how to center the power, how to shift the power to more of the communities, grant seekers, and really think about that shift.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, what's your view of where we are?
So can I make a pun and say that philanthropy's in flux? I actually do. I actually think philanthropy, and someone was making the flux puns in the back, and they didn't read off my notebook, but they could have. In that, I actually think philanthropy is in this really important moment, right? We have had 100+-ish years of institutional organized philanthropy, and I think it's looking at itself in some ways and asking, have we done enough? After all that money spent, all that effort, have we come far enough as to where society was when we started this and to where society is now? And I think that there's a reckoning that's deeply going on in the sector, and one that Kathy hit on, which is, who is really centered in this moment? Who's really benefiting from philanthropy? And I think a number of foundations are asking that question and starting to do the work around that, but we'll see. So I would say we're in a tough moment right now with philanthropy. Like, it is having a conversation with itself that it needed to have. And I'm optimistic about the future.
I'd be curious in the audience, compared to when you entered the field to where we are now, are things better? About the same? Worse?
Are there
no
any
hands
votes?
at all anywhere.
We went through an interesting, with the downturn in the economy, 2007, 2008, so many organizations were held at corpus, like you couldn't give if you wanted to. So I think that from the nonprofit perspective, they're still reeling from that.
Microphone is coming to you, actually. Hang on one sec.
So I was saying, in 2007, 2008, I was actually inside of a nonprofit. Like I was a grant writer. And so at that time, all of a sudden, we were submitting proposals and being told, hold on, we're at corpus, we can't give any money. And it was the song that we were hearing over and over and over and over. And now that a lot of foundations have merged from that and are back to giving, I think a lot of nonprofits, at least that I have talked to, a lot of my friends, not necessarily my grantees, are still a little gun shy. Mm-hmm. And they're still not giving out at the same levels in some communities because they're holding back because they were like, we weren't prepared, we weren't ready for that, and we weren't ready for the organizations that had given for them for years. I mean, in one of my friend's case, she was an executive director that had given to them for over 40 years. And to have a family foundation come to them and say, we're so sorry, but we cannot.
We have no money.
Yes, we have no money. And now they're, of course, funding them again, but she's like, I'm also having to watch our budget and make sure, well, what if this happens? Mm-hmm. And the need has grown so much. She deals with literacy issues, and the need just continues to grow and continues to grow. And so I don't know. I try to be a glass half full, but I think sometimes it just sort of takes us back if we think where we've been in the last 10 years.
I think that's a really important perspective, and the fact that the economy might be what is hiding some of the real issues that we probably want to talk about here. I'd like to go through a little bit as to what are some of the specific things that you see as obstacles, Kathy. What are the things that philanthropy isn't thinking about and that are the things that give you direct headaches? Is it too many strings on grants, not moving fast enough, the lack of understanding of what you need? What are some of the issues you would name?
Yeah, you know, I want to be mindful of the audience, right? This is a Flux conference, and you all are in operations or some aspect of operations. And I do think that, especially with technology, you can make operations much more efficient, have communications be a lot more easy. And at the same time, it does feel, from a grant seeker's perspective, that quite often it's the operational aspects of the foundation that create some kind of barriers, right? So it's the reporting system, and it's the turnaround time on the, getting the proposal in and then getting an agreement or any of those kinds of things. And then, of course, reporting requirements. So I think it's really trying to figure out how can there be a better partnership between the grantees and the grant makers around, of course you have to have structure and operations, but how can we make it so that you can take care of business, but it doesn't create a barrier for us in the field? Because in the end, and I really saw this when I was at the Tides Foundation, the folks who are doing the work, they just want to get the work done. And okay, if tell me I have to do a report, okay, that's fine. But I have to write 40 reports each quarter. That's a lot of work, and that's taking away from our ability to actually do the work too.
Great point. Tyler, I think you've seen it from many sides of the equation as well. But let's talk about nonprofits do terrific work, but sometimes they're not perfect in this equation either. What are some of the things that you think they need to do a little bit differently? Is it speaking up more, being more honest about when they're having financial issues, talking about the work? Where do you see the?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I also want to kind of set the stage of the dynamic, which is you have a group that has all the money, right, and a group that doesn't. And so it's important that when we think about who's providing barriers, that is not the group that is resource strapped, right? They're doing everything they can to navigate a complex system to raise money and do whatever social change work it may be that, particularly in this political moment, is certainly uphill. So I just want to kind of point in showcase the power dynamics at play. I would say that as a funder, the grantees that I really had the strongest affinity and affection in relationship with were those who were, I think, really clear about developing a relationship that went beyond the kind of transactional grant and organized, in fact, their funders for the cause of the mission, for certainly the cause of the organization itself. And so I think when I look back at who's doing what right in a really important way, it was those who saw beyond the next grant cycle to the entire relationship and the opportunity to organize philanthropy just as much as they're trying to organize for whatever kind of systems change that they might have or want to seek.
Can I build on that? So I really appreciate that because I feel like we've been able to do a lot of that kind of like educating funders, especially about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander issues. But I have to say, in some cases, it takes 3 to 8 years to do that kind of cultivation with any given funder or any group of funders. Nobody's paying me to do that, right? I mean, I somehow have to cobble all my funding together and say, oh, okay, this is a long-term investment, 3 to 8 years, and I want to continue to be of service and of support and of education to the funders, but who's going to pay my salary in the
That's
meantime?
exactly right. Right, which is, I think, my point around even in that the entire system in some ways is rigged against that.
Right.
So what are some of the things that foundations can do that will make things better? There was an essay published a couple weeks ago that suggested that on April Fool's Day, foundation program officers ought to go shadow executive directors of nonprofits. The idea was, this is a serious issue, but let's be a little lighthearted about it. But everybody should understand how to walk in an executive director's shoes, in part because even if people have worked often at a nonprofit, they haven't necessarily led the organization when they go to the grant-making side. What is it like to balance the budget, to worry about all the stresses that somebody like Kathy has to worry about? And that got a great reaction from people of saying, oh, we ought to be doing this.
I wouldn't want to do that.
Yes, that's the thing. Would you want your firm to do that? What are some of the concrete things, though, that we can really do to make a difference?
Well, I want to tell a story of about 3 different foundations, just to kind of compare and contrast. The first case I want to talk about is the California Endowment. So I'm not saying anything that Bob Ross hasn't said on stage. In fact, that's where I'm getting all this information. And what's been really interesting about the California Endowment, they're based here in California, and they do health funding, is they're just closing out a 10-year, $1 billion initiative called Building Healthy Communities. So it was 14 communities, funding them for 10 years, and really trying to make change. Because what they said is they didn't want to just do cycles of grants, and it didn't really add up to anything. So they're just completing the evaluation of that. And what Bob has said in a number of public settings is that the first 2 years, it was really hard. They came in with like a theory of change and how this $1 billion was going to get spent, but also trying to democratize the process and have communities say what they wanted, and the communities would say what they wanted, and the foundation would say, no, that's not quite right. It's just like back and forth. And so he really has been able to say publicly about how much they learned, how many mistakes they made, and how important it is to center communities, to center affected communities in really helping to drive what the programmatic agenda should be. That's really, really, in many ways, a revolutionary approach. And I do hope that in their next iteration of whatever it is that they do, that they're really, really going to go by those principles. That can contrast then to another foundation where the principles of social justice and racial justice are really espoused publicly quite a bit. And yet, the challenges in finance and legal, along with program, that the departments are so siloed that in many cases, legal and finance ends up trumping program. Sorry for the verb, but like overturning what program wants to do. As opposed to a third foundation where you have at the executive level program, finance, and investments all sitting together. And while finance and investments don't have a say over program, but the finance and investment people are so committed to the mission and the program that they're actually part of that organizational direction. And then that level of integration allows then for the mission and the program to really proceed, and then the finance and the investment folks are just trying their best to figure out how do we support that. So I do think that kind of the comparison of these 3 examples can show you how the structure, the decision making, and how things can help facilitate change in a foundation versus not facilitate change.
Yes, and especially because their stated principles are all about the same. But how do you actually carry them out? Tyler, you're working on a book about grant making.
Shh, don't tell anyone.
Yes. Now he has to really write it. What are some of the things that you're planning on talking about that help the kind of people who are in this room think about things that they can do differently?
Yeah, well, so I'm writing this, in the process of writing this book with Jason Franklin, who's at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. And there was a book that was written back in 2000, maybe some of you have read it, called The Insider's Guide to Grant Making, written by Joel Oraz. I see a couple of nods out there. And we plan to kind of do another version of that, but really focused on social justice philanthropy and getting clear with a number of really great thinkers in the field, including Kathy, how to actually move some of this stuff forward. And it's going to address a wide range of opportunities, all the way from proposals to evaluation and everything in between. But when I think about kind of 3 areas that funders are really concentrating their efforts in right now, where I think that there's even more investment that needs to go in when it comes to time and energy, is first, I think something Kathy has said over and over again, which is who's centered in this moment, right? And this isn't just, I think, a moral argument around those most impacted need to be making the decisions about the resources. It's also a strategic argument, because as funders continue, for those funders who continue to deviate from that, they are risking obsolescence. Right? They are risking their own obsolescence and their own purpose. And I think that there's an argument to be made that if you're serious about your mission, then you're serious about driving forward with those solutions that are designed and led by people on the ground. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is really interesting, and I want to bring forward some folks at the Neighborhood Funders Group conference out in St. Louis this past year, where we talked a lot about moving away from being the gatekeeper, and you have to bear with me with this analogy, but moving to the store greeter. Right? That no longer should program officers and those in finance be the stopper of the money moving, but instead, how do we welcome people in, help them understand what's here, where we can partner with them, and maybe where we can't, right? Because not every foundation can fund every nonprofit. But it's a distinct kind of step away from screening out to screening in. Right? And I think that's a really important moment. And then this last piece is particularly for foundations who are really thinking about all of 100% of their resources, not just the 5% used for grant making. But how do folks really invest across that and ensure that mission is a part of all of their resources, so that the 95% isn't actually holding back the very 5% that they're trying to move all the time? And I think those are the questions that we're going to be asking and hoping kind of provide some solutions to.
So building on that, I think, I'm looking forward to that book.
I'll give you a signed copy, Kathy.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Because I think these are really important concepts, right? To really figure out how can philanthropy really address social justice and in particular racial justice issues. And at the same time, especially given where I sit these days, there are structures to foundations that are not going to go away. Right? So in as much as program staff want to really address and center affected communities in the decision making, as much as the operations systems can support that, there's still the executive level, and there's still governance. And one thing that I found really striking last May in the Chronicle was a study of the top 20 foundations in the country that only have 238 trustees. And of those trustees, less than 30% are people of color, and less than 40% are women. And that's, ultimately that's the decision-making structure. So there's a lot of changes, that need to be made. And let me also say, I'm not here in my Kresge capacity. I'm only here in my, my health forum capacity. But just as an observer and a partner in the whole area of organized philanthropy, these questions of structure also actually need to be taken on to really think about something.
Yeah, I would say structure in culture, right? It's still a culture, a white-dominated culture, which is not just the skin color of the people in the room. It's how we do the business. It's how we carry ourselves forward. And I think that is very much still at the core of where philanthropy needs to address, because as long as those things are in place, we actually can move all the money in different ways and write checks differently, but it's still going to be organized wealth, right? It'll still be concentrated wealth. And I think, when it comes to the future of this, it is going to be a really interesting opportunity to start to unpack that. Will it happen? Yeah, I don't know, and on what timeline.
Right.
I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. So are there people who want to have something to ask either Kathy or Tyler, or both? And if you could tell us who you are, we'd love that.
Yeah, so I'm 6 months new into nonprofit. I actually work for the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan as their grants manager, based out of Detroit. So we've been having some conversations with people within our foundation around this concept of the trust-based grant making, where you're putting less of the burden on the applicant or the grant seeker to prove their case, and more of the risk on the foundation to do their due diligence and put less strings, attach less strings to the money as they're giving, and just trusting that organization based on their track record to do what they do best. Just curious about your thoughts on this.
I actually have a thought. This is actually just a story. So when I was doing grant making, it was for capital grant making, and so looking at the financial statements of your, well, I think in any grant making situation, looking at the financial statements of your grantees is an important thing to do, but especially if you're doing capital grant making. And I like reading financial statements. So whenever I would get an application, I'd actually read the financial statements. And in a number of cases, in like 10 cases, I would literally call up the executive director and say, do you know that you have a qualified letter in your audit? Do you know you have XYZ problem in your audit? And they're like, I've never had a foundation tell me that before. So it's like, well, our foundation's reading, you know, so it's typical to get it. Of course, you want to ask for the audit. But if it just gets filed away, why ask for it, right? That's my point, actually. But if you are asking for it, you know, I always believe an audit tells a story. So you better understand the story that that audit tells you. So that's how I look at it is, yes, if you can move more towards trust basis and really do the homework when you get everything in, then I think you can achieve more of that. But my guess, just my guess, is that a lot of organizations aren't doing that. Like a lot of foundations, they're getting audits and they just file them away. What's the point of asking?
Yeah, and I think it's less about the financials. It's more about organizations having to apply for specific programs that they want to do. Like more, I guess, general operating, where we're not putting a lot of strings around the money, and just, you know, organizations that we have funded since inception that we just know we're going to give them money every year. So why are we making them go through this whole application process and all this, you know, all the detailed level information at the application side, instead of just trusting that organization and granting them money?
Right. I mean, another aspect of that with the Gen Ops, especially if you're going to do longer term funding, is that you can actually become more outcomes driven. Because you can't have an outcome in a year. It's even hard to have an outcome in 3 years. But if you know that you're going to probably fund somebody, unless they, you have to put some criteria up, for 5 years, you can start to have some outcomes, and then the Gen Ops makes sense, right? You're just going to drive to the deliverables. I mean, real deliverables, like real outcomes, not just like how many activities I had, right? So actually, if you kind of play it all the way out, you actually could probably get farther.
I think we have time for one more quick question. So who wants to have it? Right there.
Hi, so my name is Lee and I work for the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and I guess this is less a question, more maybe just some food for thought. So one of the things that we've been talking about, especially since we have a lot of faith-based work, and we also have many donors who donate who come from UU communities and other faith-based communities as well, is even just sort of shifting the narrative, I guess, in a little bit, and even just talking about whose money is it in the first place.
That's right.
So what we've really done recently is started to take a look at the question around, again, whose money is it in the first place, and talking more about how it's less about, how do I say this? It's more of like a returning of money to communities who have been disenfranchised and marginalized. And that's just by asking that question and thinking of things in terms of that narrative, it has really shifted the way that we've been thinking about things across the board. So both in our relationships with our grantees and even with our donors as well, and how we talk to our supporters. That's
a wonderful note. Do either one, if you want to comment on that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, you know, folks receive a tax benefit to have that money in some sort of giving capacity, and it is the public's money, right? And we are all stewards of it, whether you work at the foundation or you're the donor itself. You're a steward of making sure that money goes to the places that it's needed the most. I think that's helpful.
It's also just been a really important way to talk about, so even in our organization.
Can you use the mic?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was off before. to talk about, we were talking about privilege. Someone was talking about privilege earlier as well. So even thinking about it in the case that like the way I even have this money in the first place is because of certain generational decisions and things that have been happening politically. So in a lot of cases, the wealth that I even have isn't in many ways even mine. So it's really just redistributing by acknowledging that this money actually does belong to these communities that it's been taken from.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's really important. Thank you for that wonderful suggestion that we all think about. That's a perfect note for us to end on. I am sure that you have more questions. We'd love to chat with you either here or continue the conversation in various ways. We'd be happy to be in touch with you. Thank you for all the work that all of you do. It is very meaningful and incredibly important in the work of making change happen. So thank you for that.
Thank you.